You can't last a career in teaching if it's about you. I mean, you can, but it's going to be a pretty miserable existence as far as I'm concerned. I mean, to really find joy in teaching, it has to be about the students.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Everything Band, a podcast that features conversations with composers, conductors, and performers of music for winds and percussion. My name is Mark Connor. I'm a composer and educator, and each week I have the great fortune to speak with and share the stories and wisdom of musicians and leaders in the band community. The Everything Band podcast is a proud member of the Music Teachers Development Podcast Network. The Muted Network provides support in the form of audio on-demand programming designed by and for music educators. You can find more information about our network at mutedpodcasts.com. Before we begin, I'd like to thank all of you for listening. I really appreciate your time and hope that you are finding value from these interviews. I rely on word of mouth and social media to bring the show to new listeners. If you think you know one or two people who might find these interviews useful, please let them know about it. You can also help by following me and sharing posts on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Remember, help your students live up to the best that is in them through music. And now on to my next guest, John Denis. Hi, John.
Hi.
Thanks for joining me today.
Of course. My pleasure.
So, John, can you tell the listeners about yourself and what it is you're doing and why you're on my show?
Absolutely. So I'm a Texas band director. Was born and raised, came up through the programs here, and then taught band for 8 years in the state, mostly at the junior high level, although my first job was 6 through 12. So I was teaching both the junior high beginners and high school band. During that time, I was very fortunate to work with some amazing band directors. We had a couple of Texas Honor Band finalists, which was very cool, in there as well. Although if I took credit for that, that would be me being a bad person, because I feel like both Pete and Lisa are amazing teachers that I learned so much from. But it was still very cool to be a part of that. And then during that time, I got my master's in music ed at UNT, North Texas, and Debbie Rohr, the department chair at the time there, convinced me to come back and get a PhD so that I could kind of transition into training future music educators, which is now what I do at Texas State University, which is one of the larger music ed programs in Texas, actually. And just to brag on it a little bit, our kids are just absolutely amazing. They're killing it in such a way that they get hired 100% in the last couple of years I've been here of our students who wanted a teaching job have gotten one, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit later about getting hired in Texas, because I think it's different there than almost anywhere else. But before we do that, can you talk about your early days? How did you get started in music, and maybe the story of like your origin story as a musician, I guess?
Absolutely. So my parents are not really musicians, but my dad grew up in a very musical household. And, you know, I was growing up in rural Texas, and I'm not really a football guy, which for some people may be like, oh, that's confusing sounding. But you have to understand that football is essentially a religion in Texas, particularly back in the 80s. And so it was always something that I kind of just, I felt a little out of place as a kid. And so I was looking for something somewhere to belong and something to engage with and do. And I always had kind of a bit of an artistic bend, even as a child. And so my dad was like, hey, you should do music. And the school, the district in the town that we were living in pretty much only had choir and band. The orchestra was not a thing in Texas back then, really at all. And so I looked at that and I was like, my voice was already changing. I went through puberty pretty early. And so even by 6th grade, I was like, I don't know how I feel about this. So you know what? My dad was in band for a couple years. I'll do band. So I tried out for band. And then I had two absolutely amazing band directors who really kind of poured into me in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. Mr. Biershank and Mr. Furcci were both just absolutely phenomenal individuals and teachers. And so it was a place that I really felt like I could be expressive, I could do creative things. And that was pretty uncommon for me at the time, because I was not in any team sports at all. That was not really me and who I was. I played tennis a little bit, but that's also kind of a frou-frou sport for the early 90s rural Texas. And so it was definitely a place for me to find some belonging. And then it turns out that I actually just really ended up loving it as I got into it. I just loved the expressivity, the emotional expressivity that comes along with music, and that if you're feeling down, you pick up your instrument, you play, you can improvise and create sad music, or you're feeling happy, you can play happy music. And it was just a real great outlet for me. I knew I wanted to teach even when I was in 5th and 6th grade. So as I got kind of more into that and into band, I was like, okay, well, now I know what I want to teach. I want to teach music. And so I had decided that very, very early in my life, much to my parents' chagrin, actually.
Did you mention where in Texas this was?
So this is in Weatherford. It's about 40 minutes west of Fort Worth. And now it's basically a suburb. But back then it was still pretty country. And I say that, and that kind of makes it sound more in a poor light. Two of my oldest friends are from my time there, and I've known a lot of really nice people who are from there. It wasn't really me personality wise, but it's not a bad place,
So you mentioned that you knew early on that you wanted to teach. So I knew that too, but I didn't know until I was a senior in high school that it was going to be music, because I grew up in a family of teachers. Both my parents were teachers. Where did that impulse to teach come from?
I'm not entirely sure, because my father ran hospitals for a living, and my mom was a stay-at-home mom. So, it's completely out of the realm of my home life, But I think even from a young age, it was about helping people to understand and to grow. I've always had that kind of on my heart, that's an important thing in life, and it's something that I struggled with. I mean, not to go into too many details about that, but I'm an only child, and there was a fair amount of kind of disconnection in my childhood in a lot of different ways. And so I think it was the act of really giving people tools to make change in their lives in the ways that I wanted to make change, and the ways that education, and then really more, not just the education process, but knowledge in general, allowed me to make choices in my life and set forth paths that were very, very meaningful and edifying, and then to be able to give that to others. So for me, it was very much like even from a young age, it was very much about empowering other people.
I'm gonna jump out of chronology a little bit from my normal interview, and I'm gonna ask you, because you're a music ed professor, you're preparing young educators to go out into the world, and we're talking about this call to teaching. And one of the things we're facing as one of our biggest problems in all teaching fields, but particularly in music, is the phenomena of young teachers leaving after just a couple of years. And so from my perspective, I always knew I couldn't do anything but teach. And so that was always going to be what I did. And so I kind of persevered even when times were tough. What thoughts do you have on that? Maybe helping young teachers get through these early years?
Well, I think a couple of things. One, being realistic. I think having a realistic understanding of what the job is and what it's not. It's not going to earn you any kind of praise from the vast majority of people you run across. You meet somebody and say, "Oh, I'm a band director," and the first thing you're going to get is, "Oh, yeah, I used to be a band, but I quit." So it's not. There's no cultural prestige or capital that goes along with this profession. So you need to kind of understand that if you're looking for motivation, it can't be from the society at large, because that's simply not. That's not going to happen. The second thing is ask for help. There are going to be difficult times. You're going to have difficult parents. I try not to tell too many stories to my undergrads, because I have a lot of parents who were just incredibly difficult to deal with, students who were incredibly difficult to deal with. And that's the reality of it, because in some ways it's a customer service, customer facing career. You're dealing with people, and you're dealing with people who have wants and desires, and those things may not always be aligned with you, or they may not even always be appropriate, or even legal. And so, you having people that you can talk to about those kind of struggles, when a parent threatens you, or when a kid says something, racist in the classroom, or, those kind of things can be real bummers. And if you put your self-worth into what a 14-year-old does on a day-to-day basis, you're going to be in a bad way. I mean, it will drain you and wear you out. So, you have to have those touchstones in your life. And it's different things for different people, but you have to have the things that are the foundations that are outside of what the teenager may or the elementary student may be doing at that moment, or the parent may be doing or saying about you at that moment. And then I think the final thing is to realize the hours, particularly in band, but realize the hours in general that go on to this and plan accordingly. Because, and I tell this, I meet with all of the student teachers here at Texas State before they go out and student teach, and we have a little conversation about what to expect and that sort of thing. And one of the things I talk about is you got to go to bed early. You have to drink lots of water. It's going to take a toll on your body until you figure out how to navigate this. It takes a toll on your social life until you figure out how to navigate this. There are requirements that will be put upon you that are sometimes unreasonable. So my first job, I went to work one Friday morning at 7 and got home Sunday morning at 4:30 a.m. because I was assistant band director. It was 6 through 12. And we had homecoming that Friday. So we had all the regular school, then football game. And the head band director had scheduled 2 marching contests in a different geographic location of the state. It was about 4.5 hours away by car, because lots of driving in Texas. And so we drove into the marching contest. We performed at the first one, drove to the second one, performed at the second one. We made finals at the first one, so we drove back and did finals. We were the last people to go at finals, so we didn't take the field until about 9:30-ish. Then we had to wait for results, and then we had a 4.5-hour drive back home. And so that was a beatdown. I mean, it just was, And so I feel like that people get burned out because of the emotional stress and the physical stress in their bodies. And you need to have ways to be able to combat both of those. So you need to have the foundation for your emotional being, so that when a teenager says, "I hate you, you're ugly," you can be like, "Well, that's nice," and move on with your life. And when you have those moments where, I worked 75 hours this week, that doesn't just absolutely crush you as well. And that's not every week by any stretch of the imagination. But there will be some moments where that sort of thing happens. It's feast or famine, I feel like, particularly on the secondary ensemble front. Elementary music, not nearly as much. And so my advice to young teachers is know why you're doing it, have some kind of sense of yourself and your self-identity that is rooted somewhere else other than the kids' feedback or the parents' feedback, and take care of your body.
Yeah, John, you're saying a lot of things that echo my music ed professor when I was an undergraduate. And I mentioned this when I talked to you that he passed away while I was studying with him. And I took his woodwind methods courses, and he gave us his philosophical considerations, and I still have them on my desk. I keep them on my desk, and they've been there for like 30 years of teaching.
That's awesome.
And the very first thing he told us that I wrote down in my notes was, you have to love the kids enough to take it if they don't like you.
Yep.
And I'm just thinking about the things you're saying, and these are things that are really important. You have to really want to be in that job because it's hard.
Yep. I have a friend of mine at church who was asking for his daughter, and I said, if she doesn't really want to do this, then steer her another direction. Not because I think it's bad. I love it. I train people to do it all the time, and I get up every day and be like, I get to go teach band today. This is awesome. But if you don't have that passion for it, some of the other stuff is going to make it very hard to navigate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because all that extra stuff is hard. I was a high school band director. I had a parent screaming at me in a parking lot in Reno, Nevada, after the Reno Jazz Festival, because their son was second chair and not first chair alto. It's just like, this is the gig, right?
Yeah, my favorite horror story comes from, I'd probably been working at the school about 2 weeks. I was hired in like early August, late July. And this kid was in Texas, we oftentimes have varsity, non-varsity, sub-non-varsity. We have different bands. So we had multiple bands at the school. I was the head director. And this kid was in one of the bands I didn't teach. He was in assistance band, but he's a percussionist, and I'd caught him being off pulse. And so I went and stood behind him for seconds like, hey, we need to get locked in on pulse. Make sure you watch the director. And then I walked out to go to the restroom. By the time I had gotten out of the restroom and back into the band office, the principal was down there waiting for me. He says, you need to come down to the front office right now. So I go down to the front office, and this gentleman sees me and says, you're the band director? I said, I am. He goes, if this ever happens again, I'm going to find out where you live and kill you in your sleep. And I was like, okay, who are you? What do you think happened? And what are we talking about? Because I literally don't know what's going on. Well, it turns out that the instant that I left to go to the restroom, the kid asked permission to go to the restroom. Assistant was a first-year teacher, and so she's like, yeah, sure. And then he went, immediately called mom and said that I attacked him physically. And so he lied to mom. Mom sent dad. Dad came up and threatened to kill me. And, that's terrible. And granted, there are other things like the administration could have warned me a little bit better, and there are other things that could have gone down to make that smoother. But, you teach long enough, everybody's going to have at least one of those stories. And so what do you do with that? You have to be there for the kids,
You do, and you have to understand. And I don't know. I don't want to get into some deep philosophical discussion about how the world's changing and helicopter and lawnmower parents and all those sorts of things.
I'm happy to talk about it, though, if you want. I have thoughts.
Oh, we could. My father was a teacher for 50 years. And he would tell the parents at parent-teacher conferences when they first came in, if you believe half the stuff they say about me, I'll believe half the stuff they say about you. I mean, it was kind of, he made a joke out of that.
Right.
It's like the telephone game.
Yep. Well, and I love kids to death, but kids are human, right? And they're young humans. So there are maturity issues that they may say, lying about this is really the best plan. And somebody with a little more life experience may go, no, that's really not smart at all. But they're kids,
Tell me about what you do at Texas State, and tell me about the music ed program there.
What I do is I'm one of our instrumental music ed professors. I'm the band person right now. We're actually in the process next year of hiring another band person because we have quite a number of band students. But I teach methods courses. I teach woodwind methods and concert band methods. And then we have a colleague of mine who teaches arranging and marching band methods. And then we're hiring somebody to fill in kind of the brass space in the future. The program here, what I love about our program here is that it's very practically focused. So our students take how to be a marching band director class, how to be a concert band director class, how to teach all of the instruments. And it's really, those classes are really designed to not just how to play them, but how do you really teach them in a class setting. Now, in Texas, the majority of our teachers, when our students here, when they graduate and become teachers, are going to be teaching in homogeneous classes. Not all. So we do part of it where we teach it as if it's homogeneous, and then we do some heterogeneous stuff so that they're prepared for both. They actually have to get up and teach all the time. So we do these mini lab teaches. So every Friday in the methods classes, I don't actually lecture. They actually have to teach the things we discussed on Mondays and Wednesdays. So we spend Monday and Wednesday talking about how to execute, how do you find the sweet spot on a flute head joint and get them to make a sound with a proper embouchure. And then on Fridays, they actually stand up and put that into practice. So they have to teach their peers. And then when we get into the ensemble methods courses, we do the same thing, but we do it with rehearsing pieces, doing sight reading, handling classroom management. This is probably their favorite because we send them out of the room and then we get to all pretend like we're 15 and be little turds. And then they come back in and they have to rehearse their piece while we're purposely misbehaving and practice their ability to redirect and to handle things when they get interrupted. When they have somebody raise their hand and ask if they know how much blood was spilled in the War of 1812 by metric liters, as an example.
Sorry, I have to laugh because that's
you have
so
to laugh.
True.
And the best part about it is both my colleague who teaches the arranging and marching band tech classes and I, we both have several years of public school experience. And so when we get to that point, we literally just sit down and be like, okay, what's the greatest hits of bizarre things our students have done? So like that 1812 one, that's a quote from a student. There's no way I could make that up. I'm not that creative. And so, we spend a lot of time really, okay, what are the nuts and bolts of how to do it, and what's the underlying philosophy and theory about why it works here. And then, so that's our undergrad stuff. And then we also have a graduate program where we dive even, more into that. We do like an advanced rehearsal techniques class and psychology of music and, how to really read research and that kind of stuff.
So let's talk about some of those nuts and bolts things. And so what are some of your best practices for classroom management?
Okay, best practices for classroom management. I love talking about this topic, by the way. This is like one of my nerdy, let's go to town topics. Procedures are your friends. You need to have procedures. Procedures are anything that you want your classroom to function. So anything you want people to do. How do you want them to stand when they come in? How do you want them to walk in? How do you want them to get your instrument out? Where do you want them to put their cases? How do you want them to assemble their instrument? How do you want them to go to their seats? Do they get stands or not? Do they get music or not? And how do you want them to warm up? Then how do you get their attention when it's time to start? And I know I'm just kind of rolling on that, but procedures, you plan out all of the little details about how the class should function and teach it to them like you would teach them how to play a concert B flat. Because the thing is that those kids are coming from wildly different home lives and wildly different class experiences. So I tell my undergrads this all the time, that if you want them to understand, you better teach it. Don't expect them to know that it's quiet. You were mentioning earlier a cultural thing, right, with some of your students from Israel where they're expected to talk more. So if you want them to know to talk less, you have to teach it to them.
Absolutely. You're right. And they don't quite understand it first. It takes time.
Right. And so you have procedures, you explain it to them, and then you practice them in the same way you would practice getting a note correct or starting and stopping together. Right. So one of my big procedures is I let my students warm up, talking about in ensembles, not when dealing with beginners, but in ensembles, I let them warm up ahead of time. I give them sheets, say, here are the things you can play as a warm up. And then when I step on the podium, everybody stops and we start rehearsal. Well, the first 2 days of school, I probably do that 27 times. They'll play their warm-up sheet, I'll get off the podium, and then I'll get on and I'll say, oh, well, that took 12 seconds. Let's see if we can get to 5. And then we'll do it again, and we'll do it again, and we'll do it again. And we're practicing, we're teaching, I'm making sure they understand why. And I don't do a lot of rehearsing in the first 2 days of an ensemble class, because I'm just trying to get them to feel, we'll take our instrument apart and we'll put it together. I mean, we'll actually practice all those things, because they need to know, and it takes time. And I'd rather spend the time in August than be frustrated in May.
Yeah, you can't say that enough. You and I, we just had an 2-hour conversation about my first year back teaching 4th graders, or my first year ever teaching 4th and 5th graders. And, I don't think I did enough of that in the beginning, because boy, at that age, you almost have to spend more time on this stuff than anything else.
Absolutely. And I do. I mean, even when dealing with older kids, that first week of rehearsal, as far as I'm concerned, is not about the music. It's about how do you function in band.
So how do you balance this? Let's say that you're in a job where you have like a band camp before school starts, and then you have regular band when they come in. Are you working on those procedures in band camp, or is band camp just to work on the band camp things and then procedures of the first week?
I'm working on procedures in band camp, and everywhere I've worked has been in that situation, even the junior highs. And that's not an uncommon thing in Texas to have like even beginner camps before school starts. That's not super common, but it's common enough that people don't look at you sideways if you're like, we're going to have our beginner camp and it's going to be these 7 days or whatever. And yeah, I'm from the very first moment, I'm all about establishing procedures. This is how we do band. This is how we function in band here. We do it, and you do it for a few reasons from the beginning. In recruitment, as you well know, right, community and reputation are king, right? Those two things are the things that drive almost everything. And so if I don't have a band hall or an orchestra room or whatever, but if I don't have a rehearsal space where I know they can come in and they can not attack each other, I'm not providing community. If we're not working towards a goal, I'm not providing that sense of community. And so I wanted to just be, this is how it works. And, based on both my own life experiences and those of several of my students, you really don't know what's going on in their home life. Like, you may have some people whose home lives really work against you on getting them to come down and be calm and focused. And so you've just got to take the time. And so when I do camps, that's why I don't really do it it doesn't take the whole first week for me most of the time when I was band directing, because as soon as I see them, this is how it is. Like, we're going to do this, we're going to practice these things. And so for those students who, were in, the Bahamas or whatever during the camp and couldn't be bothered to actually show up, we do it again for the first 2 days. But in general, I find that it kind of, it tapers off pretty quick when you just, this is how we work. We start here, and it's great for, like, you come back from a break, right? Come back in January, and they're acting squirrely again. If you remind yourself, well, yeah, because they've all been in their homes and the expectations and the environments were different. You can say, let's review our procedures and how we actually function in band, and spend 1 or 2 days doing this. I get questions when I tell people this. Well, aren't you worried about how much time you're spending and it's going to cost you? I find you get more than the time you spent back, and how much you save in rehearsals in, say, March, like, than anything you spent in August.
Oh, I would agree with that 100%.
So I think that's one of my big tips. The other tip is that you need to find out what's motivating the student. Part of this is because, in my like researchy professor side, I'm a bit of a behaviorist. And so behaviors happen for a reason most of the time. Not that all students can articulate it, but there really is a reason why kids do what they do. And so when dealing with behaviors that beyond just we haven't quite learned how to function and we haven't quite learned our procedures, those you're just going to do and teach and review and practice until they got it. You have to figure out why they're doing what they're doing once you get beyond that basic understanding of procedures, and then respond accordingly. So, it's not a one size fit all. You're talking in class, therefore I'm going to call you out from the podium and I'm going to shame you. Well, what if that student is doing it because they really want the attention? Well, now you've given them the attention in front of all their peers, and you've actually given them the thing that's going to make them misbehave more, not less. So you've got to think about and figure out, and this, we all get to be a little armchair psychologists for this, but if you don't know your students, how can you expect them to behave, and how can you expect to guide them to the right kind of behavior? You've got to get to know the kids and what makes them tick and what drives them. And sometimes it's going to be rough. I mean, I had a neo-Nazi student several years ago whose whole family was like hardcore into that. And that was a very difficult experience for me, because let's just say I don't share any portion of their worldview. And so I had to understand enough of it to be able to figure out the ways to try to get them to not be that way to the largely Latino population in their class. And my dad was actually born in Venezuela, and so I've spent a lot more time in that kind of cultural space than the space that I was dealing with this kid. And it was a challenge. It was a real challenge. That's probably one of my least favorite students. That's my student. I could never name my child that name. And yet he was in the class. I couldn't remove him from the class, and we just had to kind of come up with a solution for it. And it took about 5 months to figure out enough to get it where we weren't having racist, violent outbursts.
As Dr. Tim said, our toughest students make us the best teachers.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything that somebody could throw at me in terms of classroom management now after that experience that would completely throw me for a loop.
Yeah, that's pretty intense.
Yeah.
The other thing Dr. Tim said when I interviewed him is people only hear and understand what's relevant to their perceived survival.
I think I might say, for varying definitions of survival, like for their thriving more, like that they'll start with survival, but then there will be moments in which their ideology isn't really necessary. Like you're not threatening their ideology in a way that you're threatening their actual, like, continue to chance to exist on Earth.
Sure.
But they interpret it that way a lot of times. And so, you have to consider those factors if you want to be able to make headway with those very difficult students, because just coming at it to try to bowl over, I'm going to scream and dehumanize the opposition until they just feel so ashamed they're going to capitulate. That never works. When it becomes a power struggle, you've already lost at that point, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to classroom management. The instant you have turned it into, I have to prove a point to control this student that way, you've lost. You're not going to get what you want out of that student. And so, it's tricky because, referencing my special child, some days I would finish that and I would walk out the back door. My band had a loading door. And I'd walk out the back door into the field next to the school and scream bloody murder. I'm not going to lie. Because it was so hard to keep it in and to not. I was fortunate that I'd already been teaching for a while by the time I had this, but it was so hard to keep it in and not to just explode and turn it into that power struggle that I would be so emotionally worked up that I'd tell my assistant, I'd be like, you have to handle the beginners for this class for the next 10 minutes. I'll be okay, but I have to step away because I'm just so incensed that I can't treat them equitably. I can't treat them the way they had nothing to do with this kid doing his thing. But I had to step out because it was the only way I could keep it in during the time I was in. And then you just eventually had to find what was something that he wanted and what was something he didn't want, and use those things, in the behavioristic sense, right? Let's take the kid who is talking to get attention. Well, if he's talking to get attention, I give him attention when he's not talking, and I don't give him attention when he is talking. I just say, come see me after class, and we'll do the punishment away from everybody else. Right. So you have to kind of know how those things are working. I call them in my undergrad classes, I call them know the payoffs. What's the payoff for the student? And then manipulate the payoff so that it helps to increase the behavior you want while decreasing the behavior you don't, which I know sounds kind of scientific and cold, but it's how most of us work in our brains.
Mm-hmm. Can you give me an example with maybe a more average student, maybe a more run-of-the-mill student, let's say a beginner who is looking for that attention and acts out in class? Can you just kind of show us how you would redirect that, or tell me how you do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and for the sake of argument, let's just say that we're playing a line out of the method book or something when they do that. So the first thing that I'm going to deal with that is if I already know that about the student, that they're looking for that attention, I'm going to go stand near them, and then I'm going to say, let's all try this line again, and let's see if we can do better and are playing it better and our focus. I'm not going to say anything to him. I'm just going to be in proximity closer to him. Do the line again. If we get finished the line and immediately after we're over and he starts talking, if that's a procedure I have, I don't want them to talk as soon as they finish playing, then I'm going to remind all of the students that we have a procedure. So I'm going to say, well, the example that I would ask, I'd say, how are we supposed to behave when we finish a line? Ask you to open to the class. People raise their hand. They tell what you've already taught them. Great. And then you say, okay, so let's try it again. If he does it again after that, then at that point, I'm going to say, now, Johnny, what is our procedure for this? He tells me to say, okay, please do that this next time. We're going to do it again. If at this point he's still doing it, he's in what I consider to be kind of non-compliance. He understands now what he's doing is wrong. He's doing it because he wants to, right? And at that point, that's the point where I'm going to say with a student like that, let's chat after class. And then there's going to be some kind of predetermined options for punishments for that behavior that I'm going to fall back on. Is it a writing assignment, or is it an apology, or is it, must be silent? Eventually, if they're doing it in such a way that it's keeping the other students from learning, if they're being really aggressive with it, that might be a different thing. But just your average student, I find that most of the time going through this process of, let me be near them, let me call it out to the group, in terms of our procedures, and let's practice it. Let me remind them of what the procedures are. And if they're not being malicious at this point, generally, they'll at least try to make it a little better, for your average kid. And Yeah. So I think it's just a matter of being very dispassionate and very calm, not in like a cold way, but just a very, so what is our procedure for when we stop playing? Our procedure is to listen to the teacher or whatever it is you've taught them, right? And you say, okay, well, let's make sure we do that. Let's do it again so we can practice it, right? And you just continually insist upon that kind of behavior, and you redirect them to what they're supposed to do. You point out what's wrong in the same way that you would point out, oh, that you should have been second valve, not first valve on that note, I mean, a great teacher doesn't then throw their baton down and scream, oh my gosh, I can't believe you missed that concert A natural yet again. You say, nope, okay, obviously we haven't quite gotten that yet. Let's mark it, I've worked with some people who used to do discipline logs for that. Like if you had to get to that point where you had to remind that individual student, you could say something like, this is a time to write this down in your discipline log that you had to be reminded of our procedure today. There's a ton of different things out there in how you do it. The general principle is, you're teaching them to behave. So teach them to behave, right? Don't freak out when they don't behave. Teach them to behave. So you've got to go through the steps that you would do normally when you teach anything.
All right, John, a couple questions come out of that because I'm thinking about my own students and I'm thinking about challenging behaviors that I've dealt with young students for the first time. What about the student who, as soon as they make a mistake, they put the horn down or they make a face and they shut down? What about that student?
Yeah. Well, first of all, what do you think's motivating that student?
I think it's self-consciousness. I think they have a self-esteem thing going on there.
Okay. And where do you think that comes from?
I don't know if I want to answer that on my own show.
Well, and I know I'm not going to ask you necessarily to answer it, but I think that's the first step is to ask these questions, right? So in this particular one, right, we live in a pretty failure-averse society in the United States, so it's going to come from a lot of different places, and so when that happens, maybe they don't know that it's okay to make a mistake. They certainly don't believe it's okay to make a mistake at that point, right? And so what do? You have to teach them that it's okay to make a mistake, right? And so, you don't make a big thing out of that, but you just say, you know what, let's try it again. And what I do when I teach beginners, I'm really big on this because I make my beginners sing, and this is a real challenge to get 10, 11, 12-year-olds to sing, really, because they feel very self-conscious about it in non-choir classes. So I make a big deal about, look, when we're in here, we're all trying. Failure is the best way to get good at something. And so I start very early in the year talking about this, that we all fail. But if we want to be really good, who do you like? I'll ask them. I'll say, well, who is somebody that you just really admire? And I usually get, football players and movie stars and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, okay, you do realize that every single one of them stunk at this when they started, right? And you can even go sometimes and find examples of that online, where they're just not as good because they're earlier on in their career. And so I really pound home this idea that this is part of the process, that failure is simply part of it. It's not failure that's going to be a problem in this class. It's quitting. And quitting includes putting your instrument down in the middle of playing the line.
Mm-hmm. That's a good bit of advice.
Yeah. So I spend a lot of time teaching that kind of stuff. And I know like some of that is philosophically different because I'm not just teaching them the mechanics of how to push down the buttons. But if we want them to be really good, band is, and this is what I love about band, right? It really is so much more than just pushing down the right buttons at the right time. And so, lean into that because you'll have more success in the long run and your kids will be better humans, So don't be afraid of having those kind of moments. So yeah, so you find out what's driving it. Well, what's driving it is this sense of this idea has been implanted in this child that failure is somehow lesser. So then what do? Well, that's not one that I'm going to be concerned about from a behavior. Oh my gosh, I got to kill this in the bud. I just have to replace it with something healthier. So I have to teach them that not only is failure not bad, failure is necessary for success, right? What's bad is quitting and not following through. And so we spend a lot of time, and I'll do that sometimes with my beginners. Once everybody's really on board with that, I'll have moments where I'll say, oh, somebody put their horn down. We got to try the line again. and we'll go back and we'll do that again. Not because, and I'll say, look, I'm not upset at you. That's just not how we do it. We push through it, and your job is to find where you are in the music and keep going. So let's keep going.
Yeah, it's a good way. I think back to a previous conversation. I think it was Kathy Leibinger I spoke to on the show, and she talked about how she never uses the word difficult in her classes. Nothing's difficult. It's just you don't know it yet. So she uses the yet word all the time. She never uses the word hard or difficult. And I love that. A lot of teachers have said that on this show. I'm probably miscrediting, but that comes up in a very practical way for band directors teaching beginning clarinet that I see people mess up a lot. Okay. Oh my gosh, we're crossing the break. I don't even call it that. I literally am like, hey, we're gonna play some other notes now. Here's the new fingering. You make them play that all the way down to the low notes, and then you have them pop that register key on. And then the note either comes out or it doesn't, and you just kind of move on. That's how I'm doing it.
Oh, yeah. And I go around and I do it for them. So I pop the register key the first time because I use it as a great way to check about oral cavity and bottom lip.
Do you turn the clarinet around and finger it?
No, I just reach around and pop. I have them finger the low F and low E, and I just pop it myself. And I'm huge on mouthpiece and barrel and clarinet just as a concept. So I've already been doing that for forever and a day. But it's a great way for me to check on that. And if they're in the right spot, it'll pop right out, right? And I'm just like, oh, I'm just checking something. Don't worry about it. It's just me checking for the next set of notes we're going to learn. So I go around and do that. If there's somebody who's got some oral cavity tongue position issues, which there almost always is, then you can have them check it. You can check, see if they're making the F sharp again on the mouthpiece and barrel. But then once you've done that, then you're just like, all right, so here's our new note we're going to play. Here's G, and you just thumb 1, 2, 3, and then you're done. It's hard because we make it hard most of the time, not because it's actually super hard. Now, getting from A to B natural can be tricky, but once again, we make that hard. If you teach resonance fingerings on the right hand for clarinet some of the time, so they get used to moving all 4 fingers on the right hand together, well, then you set it up so that it's not hard. Like sequencing, oh my gosh. If you sequence well, you shouldn't have difficult things in your classroom, just things that you're working towards. That's it.
Right. We talked about this on your show, the idea of scope and sequence, and how when I was teaching theory, I understood the scope and sequence so well that I knew everything that I said paid off, down the road. And so what do we do for young teachers who don't maybe have that experience with that scope and sequence yet?
They pick up Intelligent Music Teaching by Bob Duke, and they read the chapter on sequencing. No, I'm kidding, only sort of. But the idea is that the trick with sequencing is find the smallest step you think it needs and then at least break it in half.
That's a really good advice.
For young teachers, because it's smaller than you realize because you've automatized skills and you don't even know it, right? It's like, so are you a trumpet player? Is that your principal instrument?
That's mine. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So do you need to think about how to play a D below the staff in tune? Not really. When you see a D, you play it and you play it in tune, but there's a certain amount of kick slide isn't something you actively go, okay, I'm going to do this and I'm going to center my air in my mouthpiece. And you don't do those things because you've been playing trumpet for 30 years, right? I don't do those when I play saxophone. I don't think about my voicing. I just voice, right? But your kids aren't in that situation. They don't have 30 years of experience, right? So you have to break down everything into the smallest component ordered steps that you need. Now, there's no perfect order. I change my sequencing every year. I'm still changing my sequencing. I have a meeting next week with one of my colleagues I teach a class with that for us. And the topic of the meeting is, okay, what do we need to do differently in our sequencing next year? You've never quite arrived at the perfect sequence in my mind, but you get closer every year. And you find things that you forget or that you skipped and that you didn't think about. And so, if you're sequencing well, then the new thing is just putting old things together and adding a little special sauce to it, right? So back to that clarinet example, right? If you've taken the time to get their embouchure correct, if you've taken the time to get their air correct, if you've taken the time to get their hand position correct so they're sealing the keys, well then when it comes time to add the register key, just move the thumb and you're done, right? But if you didn't do that, and that's why you mentioned in the other podcast, For Clarinets Only, which I do really love that book. That book's a good example of sequencing up to crossing the break in such a way that when you get there, you just do it, you move on, right? And that's true with all of the things that we teach. All of the things that we teach can be that way. If you hit a roadblock where you're like, they just don't get this concept, you really should look back and say, okay, what did I miss? What did I skip somewhere along the way that is keeping them from really getting this concept?
Yeah. So let's talk about a couple things that are jumping into my mind from my own experiences. We talked about my program. I have 3 pullouts for my beginners. And so I'm going to teach 5 instruments next year for my youngest students. I'm going to teach saxophone, clarinet, flute, trumpet, and trombone. And so I'm trying to figure out how to best divide these 5 groups among 3 pullouts into the most homogeneous groupings I can find. And I can shift these over the course of the year. Like, for example, I could start one group with another group and then maybe flip up the groups later and move people around as they need. And so what I'm thinking is I almost need to have my clarinets alone in the beginning and maybe put all my brass together. But then I think, but the low brass need all that extra attention and, all these things that pop up. And do you have any thoughts about this?
Well, interestingly enough, the series that is coming out on my own podcast right now is on heterogeneous beginners with Aaron Cole. And it's because my personal experience is, I teach in Texas, which means most of my classes I have clarinet class, I have saxophone class, right? So that's something that I've been trying over the last couple of years to learn a little bit more about, because I know that's not the case in most places. I think just from the people that I've been talking to, the reading I've been doing, it's the fact that you can shift them really helps. Having your woodwinds together at the beginning works just fine. Certainly your clarinet and saxophones can start together, no problem. Single reed, there's enough similarities, although they are not the same. And
they're playing a different pitch.
Yeah, they're playing a different pitch.
The transposition causes problems.
Yep, they're playing a different pitch, and their embouchures and particularly their oral cavities are slightly different.
Yes.
The oral cavities are actually way different.
Yep. Yeah.
But you can get the general concept out pretty quickly on those things. And then I've had the chance to teach single reeds heterogeneously. Like I had a chance to teach woodwinds heterogeneously before. I'm not really worried about them matching pitch so much that early. I'm worried about getting them to make the right kind of sounds. And then I'll just have moments where I say, okay, flutes, play. Great, that's an A. Clarinets, play. F sharp, awesome. Saxes, play. That's a G sharp-ish if you got them on mouthpiece and neck. Doing pitch on mouthpiece and neck and saxophone is super wonky. So, I don't even really try to get them super close.
Right.
Because the neck changes a lot. Eventually, I'm going to have them play on the mouthpiece by themselves occasionally and check them for an A, check jaw pressure. But it's really not necessary to get super anal about that with saxophones. So, I'm going to be like, saxophones, yay, you made a sound. Good job.
So what do you say, for example, for the clarinet, you say that you like to start with the mouthpiece and barrel. And then yes. I imagine that you move to the top joint next and don't put the bottom joint
that
on?
Was not a thing when I started teaching. So that's only something that I've done in the last few years. So I've done it both ways. I've done mouthpiece and barrel to the whole instrument, and mouthpiece and barrel to only the top joint. I find that for me personally, the top joint works really well if I have a bunch of small kids.
Yep. Well, that's my situation.
Yeah. If I don't, then I find that we get better sounds faster if I'm just going to the whole thing.
And you just teach them to put the bottom fingers down on the throat tones right away?
I teach resonant fingers, and there are some people who feel very strongly against this. So John Binzer down at the University of Houston is very against resonant fingerings on clarinet. Mm-hmm. I'm very for resonant fingerings on clarinet. I feel like it gives stability. I'm also very for neck straps, by the way. I think clarinet beginners should be taught with neck straps.
That's interesting.
They're just giant, because it frees up a lot of tension in the right hand. Mm-hmm. So you can really focus on getting hand positions that are correct instead of please don't drop your instrument.
Yeah.
So me personally, I'm a big believer in beginning clarinets with neck straps. But in either case, I teach resonant fingerings for G from the get go. Yeah, because we do G with right hand down, and then we do, E's. I start clarinets generally E, D, C, though. I don't start them on open G. and I start them on EDC without any notation, without a method book. I start with sounds because we can learn to play a few songs when we get mi, re, do, right? So I get mi, re, do pretty quick to all of my students, and then we play a couple songs, Three Blind Mice or something like, Mary Had a Little Lamb kind of stuff. So that way they can experience some of the fun of playing some tunes.
Right.
And then we go back.
My practical consideration right now as I think about this for next year is that if I put all my woodwinds together and I teach them mi, re, do, and I do the clarinets on just the top joint, then my pitch, the intonation is just really wonky.
Yeah.
And so I wonder, am I teaching the wrong thing? Or should I just worry about the sound and not worry about that intonation early on?
I mean, and that's what I do. So I teach, because most of my career we started double reeds, and I teach double reeds this way. There's a great book that Bocal majority people have released. That's a method book. I used to have to cobble it together myself. But I teach, and when I teach those heterogeneous classes, I teach the bassoon and oboe where they're playing like in fifths. Mm-hmm. So we got a ton of parallel fifths on for the first 6 weeks of school. Yeah. And there's pitch all over the place. And honestly, I'm more concerned about whether they're making okay sounds as much as they can. And then when we get a little farther in, then I'm like, okay, let's go back and let's get playing on the same note now. And let's start listening. And we do listening exercises during that time so that they're and playing ideal oral images, so getting on YouTube and playing great examples on their instrument. So they're hearing what it's supposed to sound like. But that first 6 weeks, I'll be honest, I mean, every time I've had to do heterogeneous stuff, I'm just not worried about the intonation transposition problems at all. I'm just trying to get the embouchures to look right and the tones to sound as close as I can. And then I swing back around in like October, because I never had like a fall concert with my beginners. I just think that's too early. So I'm not worried about like, what line are we going to get on? It's a personal pet peeve. I hate that. I couldn't possibly care less. I'm worried about how they sound. And so we're doing theory exercises separate, but I'm not even reading notes with my beginners the first few weeks of school. Like, I'm not even trying to. I'm just trying to get everybody to, let's put it together right. Let's make our faces look right. And let's make the sounds as close as we can to correct. And so then when I swing back around in the middle of October, early November, then I'm going back to the kind of things you're talking about. Then I'm switching to a method book, because I've been doing either supplemental or rote teaching up until that point, myself. Some people, that's a bad word in Texas. I rote teach part of my beginners. I'll go ahead and own that. That's considered to be very no-no because they won't read as well. And there is some concern in that. But I still stick by the rote teaching, getting them to play. And so as we get into October, I'll just tell them, you're playing this note, you're playing this note, you're playing this note. Now we're all in the same concert pitch, right? And so we'll play a couple of songs that way so that they're hearing it. And then in the back half in January and the rest of the year, that's when I'm really pushing for those intonation for those things, because they don't have the wind support yet. They don't have the muscles yet. Like clarinets, oboes, they don't have corner muscles yet in October to worry about pitch. Personal opinion.
No, and I think, you asked me about tone production of my fourth graders. It's my biggest challenge because they are young and we only meet twice a week. And so a lot of what I'm doing is really just trying to get them to play. It's a challenge for sure.
And that's why I think the rote stuff is so important, because you can spend all this time trying to get them to understand the theory behind translating the notation. Or you can say, you're going to push down finger 1, then finger 2, then finger 3. And get them playing some tunes so that they play some outside of the time you're with them. I know and I understand some of the band director concerns about, at least in Texas, about teaching that way. But that's only true if you just never teach them to read in the spring.
So we talked, when I was on your show, we talked about rhythm, and Darcy Vogt Williams is teaching rhythm logically method. And I've had great success with my fourth graders doing that. When do you have the instruments come out? Because I didn't have the instruments out for at least 2 weeks, as I just taught rhythm early on.
I think that depends on where the instruments are coming from. So if we already have all the instruments the first week, then I'm bringing them out the first week.
Okay.
But if I've worked in some places where we physically wouldn't have all the instruments, because my first job was in a little suburb of Texarkana, which is a funny term because Texarkana was like 20,000 people at the time. So a little town just outside of. And so if the students were going to rent instruments, they actually had to be brought in. Like it wasn't right there next to the school. And so we didn't always have them at the start. But if I have them at the start, yeah, I'm doing, because their faces can't take 30 minutes worth of playing at the beginning. Right? So I'm going to do, here's rhythm for 10 minutes. Here's playing for 5. Here's rhythm for 7 minutes. Here's playing for 7 more minutes. And hey, 1 minute to pack up. Yeah.
I think about what I'm going to be doing in August in my second year. And I'm thinking about all these things from a very nuts and bolts kind of way. So I hope my listeners are hanging in there with us on this.
Well, and I love nuts and bolts, so I apologize to any listeners out there if this is boring, because I get excited about it.
I have a lot of people who tell me they love this stuff when I do it, but this show is mostly philosophical, as in its format. So this is a little bit different, but I really enjoy this conversation. So we should get back on track. I want to ask you a little bit about the bigger things in Texas, because, a lot of my listeners who aren't from Texas look at Texas, and some of us are like it's a different kind of creature, like it's a strange lizard, and some of us are aspiring to be there. So let's talk. We hear a lot about getting hired in Texas, and on the Band Directors Facebook group from time to time, you see someone saying, "Oh, I'm moving to Texas." What is it like to get hired in Texas, and how does that look for someone? No, this is a serious question. Like if I were to move to Texas, what would it be for me?
So just one of the things to understand is not necessarily about Texas band, but about Texas as a culture in general. So Texas is, generally speaking, native Texans are not all that interested in what happens in other places. And so that presents a challenge for people when they're trying to come in and get a job, because talking about the things you did at your old place is, depending on where you're interviewing in the state, can actually be a detriment, not a boon. So one of the colleagues that I have here now was interviewing before he got the lecturer job here, was interviewing for a high school job. And what he told me is, he said, he was talking about a few things. And at one point, the people interviewing were like, I don't know how they do it there. This is how we do it here. I'm not really interested in how they do it there. This is what they do. And they just flat out said that in an interview. And I'm not saying that's a good thing. I think that's not a good thing in a lot of ways. But it is a real thing. And it is a thing, if somebody is looking for jobs down here, that it functions in what I would call, in a slang term, a bit of a good old boys network. So your best way to get a job down here is either to be very, very good at what you're doing in another place so that it sounds very good, or find a way to do some DCI with somebody who's working down here, or work at a band camp at one of the universities, but you unfortunately, you really need somebody who can vouch for you, one person on your references who can be somebody that somebody in the state knows. And I kind of hate that that's the case, but it's the case. Lots of people, because it pays pretty well. Band directing pays pretty decently in Texas for the cost of living, because it's tied to football. And so because it's tied to football, there is money. There's money for the programs. There's money for, it's not uncommon. Like my last junior high job, there were 3 of us. I was a head director, and then there were 2 people underneath me who were only teaching band, and we only taught band. We didn't teach any other classes. And that's pretty unusual. Because of that, there's a lot of competition for the jobs. Lots of people want to be in a situation where they don't have to teach English and history, and I don't blame them. But as part of the vetting process for that, a lot of band directors will, when they're hiring, will want to know that you're a known quantity and not want to take a risk. So my best advice is know what you're doing, learn and ask people, and get where you have a pretty good knowledge of rehearsal techniques specifically, but then also find a way to meet somebody who is band directing in Texas or is connected to somebody who's band directing in Texas. Go to TMEA. You should do that anyway, because TMEA is fantastic. But go to TMEA and talk to some people, because before you start trying to look, because that's going to make a big difference in how people respond. It's a very reputation driven state. So like a large part of the reason why my undergrads make get the job offers they get is because we have a reputation, starting with Marilyn Cavett, who set all this up, and she's phenomenal. She's a phenomenal teacher and music educator. We have a reputation for, if you got a degree from here, there are certain basic things you're going to know before you get into your first year that they don't have to worry about. And so the students get a lot of interviews because of that reputation. If you're coming from out of state, you have to find a way to fill that reputation gap.
Right. So you either have to have a huge success or know people. That makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, and I hate that that's the case, because, I want everybody to have the experiences that they can have, and that there's a lot of opportunities down here. But that's kind of the way, particularly the major areas, DFW, parts of Austin, particularly Northwest Austin, like out where Darcy teaches in Leander and stuff like that. Like if you don't know somebody, or they can't go and find a recording of your band on YouTube and it sounds really good, they're not going to spend a lot of time looking.
John, this is a really fascinating conversation. Your passion for music education is obvious, and so I'm enjoying our conversation. But we should probably get to the big philosophical questions.
Okay, let's do it.
Are you ready? So I asked these of all my guests, and you and I touched briefly on this in our conversation between our two recordings. And it's, where do you draw the line between healthy and unhealthy competition in music?
Ooh. That's a great question. I like this question. I draw the line based on what's good for the students. So everything for me always comes back to the kids. Always, always, always. And so, healthy competition is competition that is helping the students to grow. It's providing an outlet for their work. It's providing an acknowledgement of the progress and the growth that they've made. Unhealthy competition is competition that's either not doing those things or focused on the band director. So unhealthy competition is competition that is, let's say 30% of, and this is not a made-up thing. This is a colleague of mine is releasing a paper about this. Let's say that 30% of one particular marching festival's score is determined by things like show design and arrangements and things the kids have no control over. That's, to me, unhealthy competition, because at that point, it doesn't matter how much the kids grow. It matters how much money the band program has, really. That's no longer centered on the students. It's centered on the experience and the product. And to me, that's the line. Now, those things can blur sometimes. You can have a school district where they have just the logistical situation where they can do some of these things, and the parents and the students really want it. It's very, I mentioned in the chat, I think it was between, that I student taught in Allen, which, if listeners don't know, it's a ginormous band program. I mean, when I was there, a student teaching, and this was years ago, they were still like 790 students in band. And now just at the high school, they're in the 1,000 range last time I checked, which was a little while ago. They had 7 concert bands when I was student teaching, and this was, like I said, more than 15 years ago, 20 years ago. I don't want to think that hard about how old I am. So some of their population was really looking for some competition, and some of their population wasn't, right? And so, you have to find what's healthy for the kids. So the kids in the top concert ensembles were very seriously competing in all region, all state competitions. And that was very healthy for where they were. And the band directors there were doing it in a way that was pushing the kids in a healthy way without being a beatdown. If they had made the kids in the 7th concert band all tryout for all region in that particular region, none of those kids would have made it, and it would have been an embarrassing and frustrating experience for those kids. And they didn't make all of the kids in the bottom concert band do that, which I think is healthy, right? It would have been unhealthy competition, same competition. But it really kind of depends on what the students and the population that you're dealing with, the stakeholders that you have, need. And so you have to reevaluate all the time. Competition may be great one year. I tell this to the kids a lot. In Texas, we have a statewide concert band competition. We call it Honor Band. And it's done based on school size. Not band program size, but school size. So, the overall state ratings of how many students attend, give the school a size number, 1A, 2A, 3A, 4A, 5A, 6A, right? And then the competitions are based on that. And I've competed in that. And I've not competed in that. And that competition can be a lot of programs who really want to compete, sometimes they have to do like 4 or 5 Saturday rehearsals and hire a bunch of extra clinicians and spend thousands of dollars for people to come in, and sometimes that's a really good fit, and sometimes the kids are not where that needs to be, and it's actually very stressful for them and turns them off of music. And so you have to kind of look at those and say, okay, this year is a good year to compete in honor band. And some years you go, oh, this is a rebuilding year, we may sit it out this time, and so for me, the problem with competition is what's driving your choice to do it and what's it accomplishing, and not necessarily the competition itself.
I also have a problem a little bit with the way we divide up schools, because a school in the suburbs, we have disparity in school districts. So that's what I should say.
Yeah. Well, and that's what's very interesting about this paper that my colleague is working on. I don't want to kind of steal his thunder because it's a great study, a great paper. And so when that comes out, it's going to be something I think people need to look at, because it's analyzing some competition results based on SES status. And SES population in the school, and there's some pretty significant findings in it that we need to be aware of. We need to think about, and not to say that you can't be a school that struggles and then does well. There's a school in Brownsville, which is on the border between Texas and Mexico, the very southern tip, that has won this honor band competition I was talking about twice. Their kids are quite low SES, but they have an amazing thing going on, and the competition is very good for their kids to get the recognition because of just some of the things that they are doing in there. Those kids deserve the trip up to San Antonio to play for all the other music teachers, and they deserve those experiences. And so it's a healthy thing for them, even though they're in that situation. But that doesn't mean it's always healthy for everybody.
How about that? I'm thinking about your story from the very beginning. That competition drove your crazy weekend where you were gone for, nearly 48 hours.
Yep.
And so it's got to be healthy for the director too.
Oh yeah. And it's super healthy for the kids to be at school until midnight and be back up at school at 4 a.m., 3 a.m., and get on a bus for a total of 8 hours on a bus. That's totally going to help the kids be better at all aspects of their life, right? And I apologize for the sarcasm there, but doing a marching competition that weekend. So there's another great example, right? Doing a marching competition, that's great. Doing 2 marching competitions 400 miles away, maybe that's a little bit extreme,
Which leads me to my next question, which is the one that I like to ask, and it gets debated a lot, but how do you find work-life balance in a career as a music teacher?
Intentionally. If you don't make a point to find work-life balance, you will not end up with a work-life balance. So you have to intentionally draw boundaries to things. And set those boundaries and then maintain them extremely. And it's interesting because when I was doing like that 48-hour thing, I was single, and it was a different experience. I'm an only child. There's no nephews, nieces. There's not a lot of call on my time outside of work, and so I could dedicate whatever I needed to at the time. But a few years in to the profession, and I got thinking, I'm not sure I want every waking moment of my life to be band. and then I had to learn how to appropriately draw boundaries. I think one of the biggest ones is drawing boundaries in communication. So I put in my handbooks limits to my communication. So if a parent sends me an email at 12:50 a.m. on Saturday, it's in my handbook. I'm not reading that, and I'm not responding to that. I'll get to that on Monday when I come back, but I'm not gonna do that over the weekend. And it's amazing when I instituted that, how many people were upset the first few months of that existing, because they were like, well, that's when it's convenient for me, and I shouldn't have to wait for a response. And so I had to teach my administrators, I had to teach my parents, I had to teach the community that I was a person, because they don't see, that's the thing, is they don't really see you as a person, you're a job. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but that's why they freak out so much when they see you in the grocery store buying milk. The kids do, like, because you're not a person who has to go buy milk. You're the band director, and the band director only exists in band. And even though they're teenagers, they don't really, or parents, they don't really think that through. So you have to kind of gently, patiently teach them that this is an important part of your life and you care deeply about the students, but they are the students and not your children that you raise. And there's an ever increasing pressure to be the one who raises the kids for teachers, not just band teachers, just teachers in general. And sometimes you step up and you do what you got to do. Sometimes you make sure that kid is eating because they don't have any food. But you have to draw boundaries, because there will be some people, just due to the hectic nature of life, who will take advantage of that. And so you have to be intentional. You have to decide those things in the cool of the day. So in the heat of the moment, you're not trying to figure out what you're going to do. You just fall back on, well, this is what I decided my boundary was. And then stick to it and find something that is non-band to do in your life. I mean, it almost doesn't matter what it is, but you need a non-band interest, hobby, activity that you can enjoy and do, just so that you can not dream band rehearsals. I've done that. Have you ever done that before? Dream music?
Oh, yeah. Well, all the time.
Yeah.
So, John, let me ask you this. What would you say to the band teacher who says, but this is what I signed up for. This is what I love. I want to do this. I want to spend all this time with the band.
And, I know people who've given up on other aspects of their life. They've purposely decided they're never going to have a family, for instance. And there's nothing wrong with that. And if that's what they want to do and one they want to pursue, I say go for it. I still say you need boundaries, because even those people burn out. Even those people get to the point where it beats them down. You need the boundaries. Even if you said, this is my life's work, I'm going to dedicate my life to this thing, you still need some boundaries so that you can dedicate it to it. There's a ton of research out there that talks about the diminishing effectiveness as you get burned out, as you get tired. If you really want to do the best job you can, you need rest just as much as you need to be working.
All right, John, big question. From your point of view, what are the big challenges facing music education and the band community as we move forward in the 21st century?
Cultural relevancy. We love, in Western music, we love dead European white guys. And that's not where anybody lives, and not where anybody's lived for a long, long time in our country. Band music in Sousa's day was pop music. Band music is not pop music anymore. And I'm not saying that it has to be, but what I'm saying is that we, through a combination, I think, of our music choices and our focus on external things to the music, that we are moving ourselves out of relevancy to a certain extent for the kids, and that's part of the reason why nobody, not nobody, but the vast majority of band students don't ever touch their instrument when they leave. Right? They're not learning to be musicians that they can transfer to music that they really care about. They're learning to be third clarinetists on Mattei on the Shore. And that is the most consistent way to get a clean recording of Mattei on the Shore. But maybe that's not the thing that's going to make music education relevant in 25 years. Right? And so I think, not to say that I think band is meaningless, I don't. But I think we need to meet people halfway. I think we need to increase our cultural understanding of different people's different musics. I'm in Texas, right? Mariachi is a thing, and it's a big thing to the Latino community. And when they started trying to do it in schools, there was a real pushback. And I honestly don't know why. I was working at the time, and I know people saying, I'm worried about competitions, and it's going to take my best trumpet players away and put them in blah, blah, blah. But, these kids, we have kids here who gig every weekend on mariachi and make that's how they're paying for school. Like, legitimately, they're paying their bills playing mariachi gigs at weddings and stuff, right? So we need to embrace those realities, because it's not like music is going away, but there are aspects of music that aren't centered on dead European white guys, right?
Sure.
And I say that to just as a slang term for that kind of Western art music, romantic period sonority style kind of thing, right? But I think that's a big challenge for us. I think in the band world, another big challenge for us is I think football is going to not be as king in the next 30 years.
Jerry Junkin talked about this in our conversation. He said the same thing.
Yeah. And so we've hitched our horse to football with marching band, and are we going to ride that sucker right off the cliff, or are we going to figure out other ways to be relevant?
All right, John, if I was able to give you a time machine and you could set the date to your high school graduation day, what would you tell yourself?
I think it's never give up, so persevere, but also understand that you don't really know what everybody's going through. And even though your experiences were pretty terrible, other people's experiences are bad too. And so it's not personal most of the time. Sometimes it is, but when it is, you just walk away. But everybody's got struggles, and it's not about whose life is, up until that point has been more difficult. It's about being kind and loving, and also not putting your self-worth in the hands of others.
All right, John, if you had a choice, what would be the final work for wind ensemble or band that you would conduct?
Probably Molly. Mark Rogers' edition. It's goofy in some ways, because it's not some major Persichetti Holst kind of thing, but I just really, really love the piece. I love the way it's structured. I love how it integrates the multiple different folk tunes. I love the contrast of the faster woodwind parts with the expanded low brass and horns in the middle of the piece. That's just one of my favorite band pieces ever. And so, yeah, I think definitely Molly on the Shore.
All right, John, is there anything coming up that you'd like to share or promote?
Going to be doing 2 different clinics at Midwest this year. And so I really think that's kind of the thing that's on my radar for right now. That's very exciting. I'm going to be doing an episode of my podcast live, which is going to be very cool. I'm going to live stream it and have some just random bits of advice for young teachers, but then also take some questions, and so that'll be fun. And then my colleague and I are doing a session on tuning with technology, which will be very exciting. It's going to be how to really get the most out of things like tonal energy and the harmony director. So I think both of those are just getting a chance to speak at Midwest at all is kind of a big deal, as I know you know.
Yeah, I know. This is I have that opportunity this year too. I'm really excited.
Which is very cool. And to have 2 in the same year just kind of blew my mind, quite honestly. So I think it's really that. It's a chance for me to get out of my Texas bubble. I've spoken at TMEA several times and I love it, but this is my chance to hopefully meet some band directors in other parts of the country and kind of, build some connections and learn from them as well. So I think the thing for me coming up that I'm the most excited about is Midwest 2019.
Well, if you ever want to come up to St. Louis, I could set you up with some programs if you want.
I might take you up on that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's the gamut in this city for sure. We have all kinds of things. So
very cool. Very cool.
All right, John, how can people get in touch with you?
Best way to get in touch with me is email. John.Denis, that's Denis, 1 N, because people mess that up quite often, at txstate.edu. That is the by far the best way. And I am happy. So if anybody has any questions about anything, I am happy to try to do whatever I possibly can. I got into the higher ed side not because I felt the need to do other things away from the schools, but to try to help all the people out there that are dealing in the schools right now. So if there's anything I can do, anybody who listens to this, I'm very happy to do so. So john.denis at txstate.edu is the best bet.
Yep, and I'm going to plug your show one more time. John's show for young teachers is called Program Notes, and that's available in the same places you're listening to this show. So give it a listen if you haven't heard it yet.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
John, thank you for being a guest on the show.
Oh, of course. It's my pleasure to do so.